like Goonies-esque with everything we were doing, like cartoony, low poly Goonies mixed with like, I don't know, Ring of Power was what we were watching, I think, at that time. And there was a really cool scene in Ring of Power where the dwarf, there's a dwarf king that has like, he's growing a tree that has this light funnel coming from way above ground, but they're like hundreds of feet underground. And I was like, let's make that as a tree. Let's do this. Let me try this. So like in an effort to be, more transparent and we're trying to post more content, trying to be a little bit more transparent with what we're working on between, Reed Thomas and Dem Kits and a few other things, and showing progressions of like Enscape and the Chaos portfolio. We decided to do a bit of we can call it a post-mortem or a review of some Halloween assets that we have built over the years between Gaines and I. And what I really want to focus on is like, one, no one knows who Gaines is. No one knows his background. He's kind of invisible on the internet. He primarily came from the video game design industry and video game asset creation industry and like VFX industry. And when we first started pushing Enscape really hard as a company and trying to get more and more folks to kind of do this visual storytelling or kind of iterative storytelling through Enscape, kind of bumped into Gaines here in Charlotte and was like, well, let's see if this is interesting to you. And Enscape kind of shook him a little bit because it was something that it's like render time and post-processing to get to something like this. So we immediately started creating Enscape assets, and that was kind of our first pass. We worked with a bunch of clients to create architecturally and architecture and interior design assets. But Gaines and I were actually hitting a wall. So with my background being architecture and construction, his being basically video games, storytelling, and asset creation, we thought it'd be a natural like, hey, you're just going to make hospital beds, and then go make hospital beds. We'll see you in a week when you finish the hospital beds. And it didn't really work that way. So we decided to use that as an opportunity where most folks wouldn't. And we said, well, how can we abstract something to a point that we have to develop a new design language between our industry and his industry to create something that's potentially a better story overall? And we've kind of talked about this Halloween scene just in written form, quite frankly, because it's just too shy to talk about it. So Halloween was maybe a month around the corner when we came up with this idea the first time, and we just started throwing things into a Revit model. So what we would do is have a chat, and then I would sketch things with the topography tool and lines and just try to figure things out. And we set up the base level of this scene in a couple of days. I think it wasn't that much.
Yeah.
And in setting up this scene, what we learned was an entire new process with working between primarily Revit and Blender, and using like Revit's internal origin and scene origin to be able to go back and forth between Blender and Revit, and Enscape is a bridge to create the assets. So what we would do is like lay out the land, lay out organization of paths using Revit subregions for topography. And actually, oddly enough, this is done before topo solids. So I wonder if some things would have changed now that topo solids are a thing. So we laid out this scene and we released it on Halloween. And between all of our social medias, I think it was like 100,000 or so interactions. We got a bunch of questions. Like a bunch of folks reached out trying to figure out how we were creating Blender assets that amiss and how we were actually using Revit's origin to effectively design in Revit and kind of decorate using Blender, for lack of a better word, and how we parsed out those assets. So we did it. This all has sound. Like we'll set some links at the end of this just so people can explore. But we kind of tried to use everything Enscape had to offer and build a bit of a story that was so asynchronous to architecture that it became synonymous with architectural workflows. So we want to go over like a couple of things. One is like that process that we used and some of the discovery that happened, get some of Gaines' feedback on, why it was tough at first, and then why that like bashing his head against a wall ended up turning into an opportunity. We're going to talk about our use of primarily subregions as a sketching tool, and then how we used negative space in some of these subregions. So like we have this whole area that we go down into a pit, which is not something you would really do, or you could potentially have problems in just Revit doing this, but we figured out a workflow that actually allowed us to carve out like a tunnel and a cavern with Revit topography, and ended up having like some really cool effects that Again, Revit doesn't really like it, but when you merge it with Enscape assets, it kind of finishes the story. And then we ran into like kind of at the end in our second iteration of this a year or so ago. We had some clients that reached out for some scene level assets. It's like they were primarily talking about like rivers and creeks and golf course kind of content. And there wasn't a good way to do that. But this process allowed us to do that. So we'll show a bit of like how we carved a river through a mountain as well. So I guess the first thing is to go over the train of thought with kind of what happens on Gaines's end when he goes into Blender from Revit. So we start this whole scene in Revit. It's all topography tools. And so it's almost like we just put a wall around it to kind of make it look like a game board. This is full scale. It's not like we shrunk everything because that would mess with Enscape's camera. So we had all topography, but we wanted this big kind of stone wall in the background. And that was our first hiccup is like, well, are we just going to pile up stones, or we have to like free form this and guess over and over and over again? What were we actually going to do? So you can see the Revit topography still behind the stone. So we exported out an FBX. There's a lot of sins in this project, things that, are not very neat and tidy from behind the scenes, but from the front end, it looks great. So Gaines kind of walk through the process of what you discovered with getting that FBX and how you kind of had like an aha moment of, oh, I can just model over the top of this, and then we can
Okay.
export out
A
an
lot of
Enscape
like
file.
3D modeling is really fun when you're like living within the context. So part of like running into the wall was like designing something, but whenever you're making something and modeling, you don't really know how it's going to be used. And Adam and I were still new to each other and getting familiar. So there's a lot of unknowns where I'm like making guesstimates and it wouldn't come out right. And so with this exercise, what we ran into was like, okay, he's giving me literally an FBX file that I can just plop into Blender, and then he'll just say, hey, I want to turn that very sharp slope that we just looked at underneath into a rock wall. And that made it very easy to just go in, grab the topology, just manually selecting all the faces and duplicating them, and then separating them into its own mesh. And then from there, I re-topologized it into quads. I started proportional editing it. So it kind of like comes out at the top right here, and then I ran deforms and other things on it to help me get this like rock wall going here. And then it got interesting because we wanted to add a mine shaft beginning right here, so we had to take that into consideration. So that was like another little layer to add in, and that kind of just ended up. And then we just, what was it, we used like the origin clicking to bring it back in.
Yeah, so we discovered that when you export an FBX, I mean, this is kind of, everybody knows this, but sometimes you know things you don't realize their benefit. The survey point in Revit, when you export an FBX, and that typically overlaps with the internal origin, which is the new origin we got a few years ago, the FBX like maintains that origin. So if you just model where things are, what ends up happening in that export is you can just bring it right back in and click the origin in your site plan, and it'll plop the asset right down where you modeled it in Blender. So we kind of learned two things. We learned that Blender kept the origin, and then we learned when you exported a GLTF back into Enscape, it also kept the origin. It doesn't rebound, like it doesn't create a bounding box back over just the solid geometry. It creates a bounding box over the solid geometry and the origin point that's in that FBX and therefore in Revit. So we could have positional data being created where Gaines doesn't have to know where things are from like an XYZ perspective. And that's what we ran into in the very beginning. It's like, no, I need the wall to be X number of foot long with these kind of deformations. We could just export the scene, and then we could just bring back in that one rock wall asset. So we use this now for like a ton of clients that we've had. Like we use this trick over and over and over again. The only negative is if you ever crop out the Revit origin when you're in Enscape, the Enscape assets will disappear because its bounding box has to be fully in the rendered view for Revit. So you have to make sure the scene origin is still there. And I've seen some goofy stuff happen where people don't move those origins. And so there's scenes like, the origin is 10 miles away or something because they've never relocated their project. And so that's the one downfall. And I know there are instances where you can't update it, but it did allow us to get into a really interesting workflow where we could layer on data, like Gaines was saying. So we could do a quick iteration on the phone. Um, when we did this, we were like still in like work from home COVID brains, where it's just like we didn't know real people existed for like a year. So we were just trying to figure out how to work, and we just screen share, and I would sketch in Revit because Gaines didn't know Revit, and then that would serve as our plate, and then we'd go into Blender and we would update based on a bunch of discussion what that plate needed to be and what things we were trying to describe. So we were working on like instance based objects and like creating a style, like a low poly style, but this is all Revit effectively. The whole scene lives in Revit. So there's been a lot of other folks actually do some really cool stuff with um, Futurama assets and Simpson assets and Family Guy assets, and like trying to match styles. And so we were wanting to prove this to a big client that you could match styles because they had a really rigorous style.
The other thing was that you kind of touched on it with like the low poly. One of the roadblocks we had was like in my brain, getting a full asset ready means an entire PBR pipeline, which means all custom materials and
Mm.
optimized for real-time geometry, which means a certain quad count or poly count. But then we just kind of settled on low poly. And what we realized is that you can still tell a story with low poly. In fact, it actually helps you tell that story because it kind of contextualizes everything to be like main character and then supporting character. And that's kind of like what we see kind of reflected here. There's more like detail in certain things, while like all these trees, you know that they're dead trees. You don't need to have them be 100% real. Preserves everything.
There's this real I spent 6 years in architecture school to realize that there's times to use things that have no detail and times to use things that are overly detailed. So typically in school, like when we did our landscape, it was like lollipop trees. It was like orbs on sticks. And then Enscape hits and everybody wants the highest quality trees on planet Earth immediately. Everybody that's using it was like, well, the trees aren't good enough. And it's like, well, your guys' renderings typically have lollipop trees. Why don't you put lollipop trees in it so it matches what you guys are presenting at a steel render? And so we just abstracted the whole thing. It was like, let's just do an entire low poly style and show that this is not architecture. So we can't be criticized negatively because it is. We are not architects, but we
There's
were
like a
trying
fine
to,
line, like where there's
yeah,
so much detail that suddenly you have a lot of opinions upon like the trees that it look realistic. And then there's not enough detail where you don't even understand what it is. So you need to walk that fine line.
yeah, like it's not that exact elm tree that's on the site. Well,
Yeah.
that's okay because we all came from the school of like it doesn't need to be that exact elm tree. Let's just put in a representation of elms. Everybody has like little blob of people they made from architecture school. People, I guarantee you, people that are going to listen to this still have a box of architecture stuff from 20 years ago that they haven't used.
Interesting.
And some of this stuff is going to be kind of nostalgic because we kind of were doing lower poly, lower material things.
Yeah.
Because once you put materials on things, now you have an opinion about its scale and its fit and finish. So we did a lot of like museum board modeling and whiteboard modeling and chipboard modeling. So we used a kind of a neutral-ish palette, except for a few pops of color here and there, and tried to keep it neutral and keep it low poly.
The most materialization we did was that it's all color based. So like everything's one color. The only exception is that we added a texture to help guide the color, and that's just a gradient. It's a black and white gradient. So like you'll notice that trees are darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. And that just helps the stylization just go a little bit further.
Yeah,
Small things
yeah,
like that.
yeah. So let's go
I
let's
was just
go
gonna go
down
from
and
like we had the rock wall, but then what we did is we realized how well that worked that we started daisy chaining that to the path here, then to like the minecart path like right here, where it's just like we wanted to look like there was a track being made here. And so that was a lot of fun. And all we did here is we just removed it and added water. So it just imagine like this immersive layer of a scene. But then we can talk about the revision. Or do you want to go down and do the pits?
yeah, let's go down to the pit because like what we're illustrating is that like we developed a workflow that I think if you guys have somebody that understands Blender or 3D Studio, there are back and forth workflows using Revit, Enscape, and those tools. and the origins within Revit. So you're able to do things like we realized that Enscape doesn't render the underside of the old topography. So why don't we make an underground cave and explore like an underground area? And so this is literally using the same like origin technique and going back and forth between sketching a rough pass of layered topography with Blender just to see what we can get. So we kind of let our mind run, uh, kind of roll away from us. It's like Goonies-esque with everything we were doing, cartoony, low poly Goonies mixed with like, I don't know, Ring of Power was what we were watching, I think, at that time. And there was a really cool scene in Ring of Power where the dwarf, there's a dwarf king that has like, he's growing a tree that has this light funnel coming from way above ground, but they're like hundreds of feet underground. And I was like, let's make that as a tree. Like, let's do that. And so we did. So we made a bunch of low poly assets and got really detailed in doing this and had a bit of fun. But it was able to actually, like, doing this, set up a workflow where when we have a client or a problem that we're trying to solve, we now have this starting place for a solution. And when we first started working together, we were like, just create standalone assets. We were just creating assets to create assets because people said they needed them. But it wasn't actually making the scenes better. It was just making like the interior design of the building better. Like, okay, cool, that's a nice couch that you needed, and the pillows have dimples on them, and they look a little lived in. But then the outside of the house, people are just like putting a big grass plane, and it's like, well, where's the house at? And it's like, well, we had a client said, oh, the house is on a golf course, and I said, well, send me where the golf course is. So we made the back half of a golf course using this, and it's like a half day to a day worth of back and forth. It's not a huge effort to do
No,
this kind of workaround.
no, and the
So
best part is you get an experience. I think like I could be egotistical and say that like that's a video game type thing, but ultimately
yeah,
architects have that just as much. Like the benefit of Enscape is like you can send off an exe to a client, have them walk around and feel the space that they're in. Why not make that an actual experience so that way there's an emotionally driven connection that they have with it? And while this is abstract, it can be 10 times as effective in an actual environment, like an actual house.
yeah, it almost like me and Gaines talk about it a lot internally here. It's like we'll be working with a client, and I again, look, went to architecture school. I've gone through everything everybody else has gone through. It's an extraordinarily difficult process, and I think that we critically think it's top notch. Like our critical thinking skills are through the roof when we actually let ourselves critically think through a problem. But somehow we lose some of like the imagination and play associated with things, which is why I think AI renderings have kind of taken off because it brings back imagination to in a certain regard. I think it's a different kind of imagination. Imagine like trying to go out and build something or like, well, I don't have the tool to build it. And then you go buy the tool and you're like, well, I don't know how to use the tool. So I guess I have to learn the tool. And then you're like, well, now I'm behind. So you're kind of thwarted from being creative when you run into roadblocks we were running in. So we'll sit down. I'm like, every client, it's like, what story are you trying to tell? What problem are you trying to solve? How can we punch up beyond your competition? And everything we do for them is not low poly. Like it's all really high fidelity. But we wouldn't have gotten there had we not abstracted things and had a bit of fun for a couple of weeks. And I've seen other teams actually kind of take cues from this and make like Enscape educational scenes where it's like you walk through a scene and it teaches you how to use an Enscape while walking through this thing they've modeled in SketchUp. And I think that's really cool for teams. I think it's really, really useful instead of just dropping someone inside of a tool and saying have fun. They're actually like educating you while opening. So we took this like one step further. This is kind of the last thing we wanted to talk about was we took it one step further. So we've got like a cliff face, we've got negative space, using Revit and Blender as two different kind of sketching tools. And then we decided like a client was asking about rivers. So we're like, well, let's just do a pass. So we did this second revision that's more like fall themed. You go across this bridge that we created and we created a river and a bunch of rock assets to plop into the river and dialyzed it. Like in the actual download, the exe, there's river noises and everything we put in this. So we tried to see if we could do some more organic in the Z axis, so in the vertical axis, trying to do a little bit more organic work with the pathway and the river. So like if you go to the left up here before the corn maze, the river continues kind of off the page. So we realized like, yeah, we can get pretty close in Revit, and then we can use Blender to kind of solve the rest of the problems. And I think that was instrumental in the handoff between Gaines and I. So like get a sketch done, then let his brain run wild, and then me come back in and go, okay, let's control it a little bit. Let's not go too crazy. And then you do another iteration. And then it's like you'll find some opportunities that I would have missed, and I'll find some opportunities that you would have missed. And then collectively we end up making something like this. So we ran this through 2 versions, and we like having like little Easter eggs and stuff. So there's a couple of Easter eggs here. If Gaines walks through the maze, there was like a final Easter egg. Hopefully we'll do a bit of a walkthrough on it as well. We're going to go ahead and put all these assets on bimkits.com just to have them. I know they get downloaded pretty regularly anyway. We've had a spike of downloads in the past couple of weeks just because Halloween's around the corner. So we did a bit of an Easter egg back here. We got a jack-o'-lantern, and we were working on a Christmas themed one.
The reflection.
It was like a Christmas factory, and this was just literally that's the Revit file exported out and then re-imported back inside of a snow globe and then put right back into Revit. So it goes Revit, Blender, Enscape, Revit, and so it's a full loop. So we'll probably talk about that one at a different time. But was there any other like weird techniques that we missed?
Yeah, there's like a whole bunch of stashed in. Like this one was a good one. Like the corn maze was like a more intricate way. So instead of like having me interpret what the maze should look like, Adam had some fun. And I think Will, the intern, had fun where like they just designed out a path and they left out these like massive like viewing areas, like general areas. And that let us kind of showcase like assets in them. And then I just went in and kind of redecorated the path, and all this is once again still origin. So there's like, it's not like we do the cliff and we add this to the cliff and we add that to the cliff and that to the cliff. It's these are all separate little snap into the in like the points. So it keeps the topology manageable per file size and everything like that. Other than that, it's like
all of these are still under the like Enscape 20K limit, but sometimes they're huge assets.
Other than that, it was more of like trying to push Enscape out a little bit more. So like we did more realistic looking grass, and part of that was that like we found like a hidden way that we could change this grass, but like that's not in this. But it's like these are just billboarded grass, but like from afar does a good job to showcase a little bit of like unkempt landscaping. We did different things with hay, and then like the jack-o'-lanterns here are cutouts compared to the ones earlier, which were topology wise. Like this is way more performant, but you can still make them glow and everything. You can still get that effect that you want.
Yeah, we actually learned that there's a lot of crossover between like how video games optimize assets and what Enscape is the language. It's very similar. Like I know there's some things we get really frustrated with where the language is asynchronous. It doesn't match. How an emissive map doesn't work the same way in Blender as it does Enscape, or a cutout or a mask doesn't work the exact same way. But then we find that the way it works actually allows us to do something slightly different. And in some cases, it's a little neater experiment in some cases. So yeah, it was just kind of interesting to go back and forth between these. And I think we're going to start walking through some of this experimentation we're doing. We don't want to inundate people, but I just see so many like tutorials where it's just like a robot's voice talking about things, and there's no real connection to like the people or the process anymore. And so we're going to throw this out and give it a try, and hopefully it generates a bit of a discussion. I'm trying to think. There was like the grass was a good one. The rocks embedded in the water was like you get some depth and some shadowing that occurs there that you wouldn't have necessarily expected, because the lighting engine in Enscape is actually quite good.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like just going back to like the reflections, very like super clean.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of amazing what we're able to do now in real time. And some of this, like anyone that watches this that's done like 3D motion graphics or 3D rendering, they'll know like the oldest trick in the book is like put planes and use cutouts. But like you can't tell in here. So we mix Enscape grass with our grass, and then you get grass variations, and you can't tell. You can't tell Enscape's grass versus our grass. We've had people reach out and say, how does Enscape grow? Like, how are you growing that thicker grass through the other grass? And we just send them those assets, the grass assets. and say we're not. It's our asset. We're just using Enscape as the base layer. And then we've got flowers and stuff in the grass too. So there's a lot of stuff here. So our hope with this is that we do a couple of videos. Folks ask a couple of questions. You can always email us. Adam at Reed Thomas will always get to me, and then we'll see what else people have been thinking about, because there's quite a few people in our industry that are doing things like this, abstracting concepts to pull them back in. And I would like for us to get back to discussing those things. If you are discussing those things, I know I'm not going to name anybody. I'll probably tag them in the comments or something. I'd love to do like a walkthrough of something that you've created. I've got a few people in mind I've been trying to pull on and have a discussion with, but hopefully this helps. Like, hopefully the process helps. We're also going to link to the actual rundown of the step-by-step guide of how you use Revit's internal origin or its base point to do this process. So my challenge is kind of, I hear every single day of the week that like the model fidelity that we're putting into things, the assets that are being created just aren't good enough. So there's this whole industry being spun up to compete with like CG Trader and Turbo Squid, but optimized polys. That's why we created BIM kits. But I don't think you're going to be able to look just within our industry to do that. So the challenge is kind of like start looking outside of the industry slightly. Teams we've kind of helped and guided over the years, they have entire VFX departments now as architects. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to tell a story to get funding, and that's akin to movie making and video game creation. We're trying to tell a story or a process to get funding, and you can do that in really low overhead ways. So that's kind of the challenge. Look a bit outside. Ask your kids if they have any friends that are messing around with Minecraft and Blender, and try to pull those guys in to create some really cool assets. So I think that's it. Like, where do you got anything we missed that we can add in? Otherwise,
I wouldn't say miss, but just like what you said about AI. Like everybody's trying to run through their tokens on an AI generation to eventually get something that like is good enough. And that's pretty akin to like going on CG Trader and looking through models for whatever it is you want, and it's good enough. But like when you work with somebody to create it and like you figure out the language where both people can, like I struggle with talking. Like we still have a disparity about like what a material is and what a texture is, but like I'm better at now at adopting it. But like there's a very technical side of my brain and a technical side of his, and they just don't always meet. But when we work in the same common playground, whether if it's this, the warehouse file that we've got, or like the residential playground, it makes actual action on a project way faster and way better, but that you don't get out of AI where you're having to settle. So like making assets with other people is very returning. Like there's a huge reward for that. That's all I was going to add.
Yeah, it's weird how we figured out that process kind of accidentally, because we were originally like, okay, Gaines is not a Revit guy.
Don't know it.
Didn't know Revit existed, and I'm like, well, I don't want you to learn Revit. And
I
then
can
we
rotate
realized that
things now.
Revit's a central, like we're using ACC, and he's got to log in and I've got to log in, and like I'll update something and then I'll just ping him on Discord and say, hey, I've laid down like the rough pass of what the topography is supposed to look like. I would love it if you would do, river work, rock work, and, give me a couple more ideas. And then 24, 48 hours later, we get on another call. He's using literally just Revit syncing to allow us to layer on story. And it's still, like, to this day, Revit's one of the only multi-user workflows that exist. So all we had to do was bridge back to Blender, and Enscape is our bridge. And so we just used the bridge that's naturally there. We didn't write software or anything. We didn't have to. We just had to unpack the process.
And getting things into Enscape was like a hilarious mishap where like what I find most annoying about Enscape, because I think it's like a great tool, what I find most annoying is like the process of importing individual custom assets and then having that match what he sees from what I see. If I go through instead of a material versus if he goes through and imports it, there's going to be slight differentiate. Like the color scheme in Blender is different than Enscape, and like you'll get darker colors in Enscape. But I can actually just go to my custom library folder, click the assets, and then just give them to you, and you put them in that same folder, and everything shows up.
Yeah, that was actually I think that's the last leave behind that we kind of we skipped over. So we're using Revit as the way to communicate the multi-user, discussion and modeling updates. Enscape was the bridge between Blender and Revit, but how did we then share our Enscape assets? That became a problem in and of itself. So we realized that we could just drag and drop the entire folder. So I think we put our Enscape assets on like Google Drive. And then at one point we put them on GitHub actually. And we would just,
There was a lot of methods to try to sync.
Yeah, we would just pull the Git, like he would push and I would pull on GitHub, or I would push and he would pull, and we would sync that way, which is totally not okay with their TOS.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to do that. But we ended up just settling for like, well, Google Drive, and we just like copy the whole folder down, or we link to that folder. And then we found some really cool stuff, like you could live update assets.
Yeah.
By doing that.
That's very heavy in the next experiment.
Yeah.
With like, they give you the raw GLTF, and that lets you kind of, if you know what you're doing, you can get away with a lot. Not that you should be using what you know, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So this got just to be, the next video we'll record, we're going to dive into, everybody knows that, Enscape doesn't have animated assets. They have these like pseudo animated assets that only they create. So like the tree shiver when the wind is turned up, right? But we can't really tap into that, except for we totally can, but we can't. So we went back to like really old school planar ways of creating animated assets, but using Enscape to iterate on those ideas. So we're going to show how we started doing experiments in particle effects and stuff between Revit and Blender and Enscape. And that's really all we're using, is just those three tools. We don't have to overcomplicate it anymore. I think you can replace Blender with 3D Studio.
Yep.
Pretty easily.
Very easily. Any 3D creator, you can just do the exact same thing. They all work the same.
So Revit is your layout tool and your communication platform for multi-user workflows. Blender is your asset creator, and then Enscape becomes your bridge and rendering platform. That's all you need. So we'll dive into that with a bunch of like planar experiments in another video. But if this is useful, again, big experiment for us. We're just trying to be a little more transparent about what we're doing. If anybody's got questions, ask, and then we'll post these for the next couple of months and see what people think. So, all right, cool. Thanks, Gans.
Yes, sir.